Hi, welcome to the sixth installment of Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. What I want to do in this video is pick up a thread that I'd begun in my previous video and focus on Gaza. And I want to, bearing in mind that I don't think I have any more insight into Israeli strategy than anybody else does, because I think everybody's just purely speculating. Because, you know, who has access to the classified conversations and policy papers, etc. But at any rate, we can apply some critical thinking. And what I want to do is I'm going to divide this video into two parts. First part, I'm going to focus again on Castex's servitudes and apply them more in depth to Gaza. And then secondly, I want to take some very powerful ideas from General Beaufre, who I think provides a very good way, a great lens for seeing what's going on in Gaza and in the Arab-Israeli conflict in general. So buckle up. Now, part one, the servitudes. In the last installment, I introduced Admiral Raoul Castex's idea of the servitudes. And the idea is that the servitudes basically are things outside the domain of military strategy that nonetheless impinge on military strategy and that military strategists and military commanders have to attend to, right? So the idea is, according to Castex, you have to have a total plan, total strategy, a grand strategy. And underneath this grand strategy, you have to have simultaneously a military strategy, a political strategy, a diplomatic strategy, an economic strategy, etc. All of these strategies coexist. All of them are subordinate to the larger total strategy. And as a result, because of the fact that they're all trying to work towards the same goal, they're going to make demands on one another and concessions to one another. And those demands and concessions are what Castex refers to as servitudes. The example that Castex turns to time after time is the debate in World War I Germany about the use of submarine warfare. There was, I'm oversimplifying, but bear with me, there was a submarine lobby that argued for unrestricted submarine warfare. And the argument was that, look, this is our best weapon. This is the single best way we have to weaken the Allies. Let's just do it. There was a policy community, however, said, not so fast. If you do this, you're going to anger the neutrals, above all the United States. You're going to push them into the arms of the Allies. It's not worth it. For much of the war, the policy community won out, but at a certain moment, the sub-lobby won out, and they announced unrestricted submarine warfare. And sure enough, the result was that the policy community was right. They pissed off the United States. The United States joined the war on the side of the Allies. And many historians, including Castex, said that the war was basically lost at that point. Turning to Israel. Israel's political and military strategy appears to be to destroy Hamas, at least in Gaza, and to end the security threat that it represents. Secondarily, I believe that Israel is keen on restoring deterrence, the failure of which was proven on 7 October. And Israel almost certainly is doing this with Hezbollah in mind, perhaps even more so than Hamas, because Hezbollah is far more dangerous than Hamas is. Now, I believe that neither Hamas nor Hezbollah have been particularly impressed by Israel's repeatedly demonstrated reticence to launch major ground invasions and to do what it takes in order to destroy either group, right? We saw this in the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. We saw this in the half-dozen limited incursions by the IDF into Gaza, where each time they would go in, and then they would stop, and then they would pull back. There'd be like a ceasefire, it quickly broke a truce. But basically what Israel's doing is it's demonstrating that they don't have the stomach for this fight, because this fight would generate enormous casualties on their own side. Soldiers lost. Remember, this is a conscript army in which the sons and daughters of everybody are on the line. And also it would require killing large numbers of civilians. And there's really no two ways about it. This is just what happens. By being so fearful, however, what the Israelis demonstrated was that actually deterrence was enjoyed by Hamas and Hezbollah and not by Israel. It was Hamas and Hezbollah that deterred Israeli action because of this fear of casualties and this fear of killing civilians. So, in effect, what Israel has to do is it has to show that it's willing to go and do this. It's got the stomach for this kind of fight. If we think solely in terms of military strategy, the thing to do is very simple. You have a massive ground invasion, and an occupation. It also calls for the fairly massive use of firepower. I know that lots of people criticize Israel for this, but the reality is that this is more or less how urban warfare is done. And secondly, to do otherwise is to risk immense casualties on your own. And I know of no army in the world that voluntarily like this, fights with both hands behind its back for fear of, risking their own lives and committing suicide for fear of doing harm. I also know that lots of people believe that a military solution is impossible. I don't think that's true at all. I think that most of the time there really are military solutions to very complex problems. However, the military solutions are bloody, very bloody, and you have to have the stomach for it. You have to care enough about it. Military solutions only fail when the parties don't care enough or aren't willing enough to put the resources and the effort into the fight. Perhaps because it's not important enough for them to actually do, but whatever. So let's walk through the possible servitudes that impinge upon raw military strategy. We have, of course, legal servitudes, which tend to forbid one kind of course of action or one tactic or one weapon, etc. These often are widely recognized. Most armies respect them. Don't use poison gas, for example. Don't use white phosphorus on people. Now, in Israel's case, I suspect the poison gas would actually be just the thing if you're trying to clear out all of these tunnels that Hamas built. Israel does not do that. Every other day I see some allegation that Israel is using white phosphorus, and of course time after time this proves to be a lie. Israel doesn't do that. Israel uses white phosphorus the way all armies use white phosphorus, which is to generate smoke, and it's a key part of warfare. There also are diplomatic and policy servitudes, and these are very important. This is where things get tricky. A reality of the Arab-Israeli war since the very beginning is that Israel's actions have always been hemmed in by the great powers or by the UN or by the United States. They basically say, you can't do this, you can't go there, and you have to be finished by a certain time, right? And this is something that Israeli policymakers, since even before the creation of the state, have had to worry about, right? They have to worry about how this plays amongst the people, the great powers, the UN, etc., who have the ability to limit things and to hem in their liberty of action. Israel has to maintain a minimum of international support, above all from the United States. Of course, one can risk blowing up American support, but we need to remember the German submarine example. There also are what Castex refers to as morale servitudes, and the public, what he means by this is that the public will demand certain things that policymakers and military strategists wouldn't necessarily want to do. I think that in the case of this war, the Israeli public wants two things. The Israeli public across the political spectrum wants to win the war. Secondly, the Israeli public also across the public spectrum wants to rescue the hostages, to redeem the hostages. It's actually a big deal in Judaism to do this. Those two things, unfortunately, are in tension because redeeming the hostages often means concession, negotiation, etc., which ultimately means strengthening the hand of your adversary that you're also trying to destroy. So I really don't envy Israeli decision makers who have to walk that tightrope. The bottom line is that Castex tells us that there must be simultaneously military strategies, political strategies, diplomatic strategies, etc. These things make demands of one another. Israel has to attend to them or not. They, at the very least, must weigh these considerations and consider them. Now, let's turn to part two, Beaufre. First of all, Beaufre makes a similar argument to Castex. He says that strategy generally becomes unintelligible if one limits it to the military domain. As, and this is a very important quote here, too many decisive factors escape it. Decisive meaning things that will ultimately decide the success or failure of a war, right? The decisive factors often escape the military strategy. Beaufre, of course, was the commander of French forces in the Suez campaign, so he knows this very well. He was involved in Indochina, he was involved in Algeria, so he knows whereof he speaks. Even in the most favorable circumstances, a purely military rationale remains incomplete and thus treacherous. He uses the word trompeuse in French. Now, Beaufre then go on to describe a different kind of military strategy. This is super important because this provides a lens for understanding Palestinian strategy. The Palestinians are engaged in a classic example of what Beaufre describes as the quote-unquote indirect strategy, which really is the only way to confront a vastly militarily superior force such as the IDF. The goal, he says, of any strategy is to reduce the liberty of action of your enemy while protecting or even expanding your own liberty of action. In a direct strategy, conventional warfare, one does this the way Clausewitz or Foch says to do it, which is through maneuver, concentration of means, concentration of mass, the right place and the right time, an economy of means, etc. In an indirect strategy, you don't do any of that. What do you do? Well, a great way to do that is by availing oneself of what Beaufre describes as an external maneuver. This is critical. The idea is to tie down the adversary like the Lilliputians tied down Gulliver, by using public opinion, the media, propaganda, international forums, and the lawfare, right, to reduce its liberty of action. This has always been powerful against Israel. Again, as I mentioned, ever since beginning in 47, even before that, the great powers, the UN, the United States, would hem in Israeli liberty of action by making all sorts of demands and setting all sorts of limits, etc. The same thing also occurred time after time in all the subsequent wars, right? All the wars basically were put to an end by the international community. They said, halt, time out, we're done here. Whether the war was won or lost or decisive or not, didn't really matter. It ultimately was, the time frame for the struggle was determined by outsiders. Nowadays, of course, every time a soldier farts, an Israeli soldier farts, the global media freaks. Ken Roth issues a statement. The UN demands a hearing. South Africa runs to a court for a lawsuit. Everything Israel does is second guess and held up for criticism. I recently saw a tweet from some woman in London named Sunny Singh. I don't know who she is, but she tweeted a video of Israeli soldiers behind the lines enjoying some kind of snack. And she writes, "I've never seen such depravity." Okay. Meanwhile, Israel, in invading Gaza, has put itself in a trap, right? How does one fight a war in an urban setting when the whole world believes that it's a crime to displace the civilians? And no one, absolutely no one, is willing to let the civilians in as refugees. It's also a crime to fight amongst the civilians because you get them killed, right? And that's a crime. So it's a crime to kill them. It's a crime to move them to safety. Brilliant. Checkmate. Gulliver bound. Now, another part of the external maneuver per Beaufre is to promote an ideological basis that's favorable to your side, right, and helps you get public support. In the time that he was writing, which is basically the 50s and 60s, he was thinking about the sort of the communist-led, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, national liberation movements of his day, like of the kind that he was fighting in Indochina and Algeria. Nowadays, a lot of that still exists, but now there's this extra component where it's less Soviet, but it's more about these sort of progressive ideas about how we're all moving forward in this teleology of progress. And then in this scheme, Israel becomes the symbol of all that is bad. Israel becomes a symbol of everything that's holding us back from human progress, from achieving this kind of utopian, Kantian future in which the Vulcans have come and taught us all how to be logical and to all get along. And after all, why can't everybody just get along? But in this, Israel's then the embodiment of bad or evil, right? I'm thinking like of Nietzsche's transfiguration of morals. And Israel demonstrates this simply by fighting. Now, I believe that this is all deliberate. I believe that this is Beaufre's external maneuver. The net result is reduce significantly Israel's liberty of action. And thus, of course, Israel elects to ignore the dissuasive effects of Hamas's external maneuver. You could just not care, which I think is something that, I fear, something that Israel is tempted to do, basically screw them, right? Now, one can decide to ignore the servitudes and charge ahead. Damn the torpedoes. That's not what Beaufre recommends, as he thinks it's largely impossible anyways in this day and age. The only way Beaufre explains is to counter the external maneuver with basically a counter-external maneuver, which sounds ridiculous, but it's actually a very serious idea. You do this to preserve your liberty of action and to try to hem in that of your opponent. How? Basically by playing the same game, but the key is that you have to take the initiative rather than be reactive. Now, how this might work, I don't have any, I don't have in my pocket, any ready-made ideas for how to do this. All I can say is it takes creativity, it takes imagination, it takes serious consideration, Certainly, things like lawfare and propaganda and the leveraging of international forums, all of these things can go both ways. It requires, though, and this is a critical thing, it requires a strategy. It has to be done, right? Israel needs, perhaps, when thinking about this, to have Castex's definition of maneuver in mind. So now we're going back to Castex. Maneuver, says Castex, is moving intelligently to create a favorable situation. Now, crucially, the idea is to take the initiative and to modify, determine the course of events. This is a quote. To dominate destiny and not to abandon oneself to it, to engender and to give birth to facts. Castex says, one does not conduct a maneuver by being subject to the will of the enemy and by accepting the law of luck. Arguably, Israel has done nothing but for the last 20 years by trying to manage the problem in Gaza rather than take the initiative. It's committed the sin in Castex's eyes of accepting the law of luck. Maneuver was, according to Castex, a creative act, one that modifies or determines the course of events. Interestingly, Castex insisted that maneuver does not necessarily mean any kind of physical movement. It could just be an intellectual shift, a different way of thinking about problems. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again on my next video. Please like and subscribe. Also subscribe to my Substack, also Pax Americana. Link in the description. Check me out on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And check out my website, michaelshirking.com. Thank you again.